Hello, and welcome to the weekly sermon podcast with Reverend Marie Duquette. You can find the full live version service on YouTube's Be Ye Lifted.
The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 4th chapter. Now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. From that time, Jesus began to proclaim, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, Lord Christ.
I want to begin by talking about the second reading, 1 Corinthians chapter 1. After the four Gospels, Acts, and the book of Revelation, 1 Corinthians 1 is the longest book in the New Testament, coming in at 9,462 words. By today's standards, that is a 39-page letter. We usually don't get a letter like that unless it comes with the announcement, "You've been served." Compared to all the books in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it ranks at number 27 in the Bible in terms of length. That is just one reason that it is not your garden variety love letter. And it is a love letter. Anyone who has ever been to a wedding in a Christian church, and many a wedding on a beach, in a front room, or in a garden, invokes the words of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, fondly known as the love chapter, which begins with the words, "You may well know by heart. If I speak in the tongues of humans and of angels but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Perhaps you're wondering, what are in the other chapters of this love letter? There's the introduction, which we covered last week. And the rest of it is a detailed account of all the things the Corinthians were doing or not doing and fighting about doing or not doing. The things that caused a group to write to Paul in the first place to ask him to please clarify the Christian teaching about these issues so they could report back. Generally speaking, the issues included unity or lack of it, baptism, the cross, men and women in church, immorality, sexual practices, food offered to idols, old covenant sacraments, idolatry, new covenant sacraments, food offered to idols, men and women leading in worship, rules dictating the Lord's Supper, men and women worshiping, subtitled, and I quote, "No chatting in church." Resurrection, ethics, and finally, concluding notes about money, leadership, greetings, and final admonitions. Kenneth Bailey, a revered scholar who wrote this book, one of two that I own because I heard him speak, and he was phenomenal, wrote at length about this letter. This entire book is on this letter. He lived in the Middle East for decades and writes from that perspective. He wrote this about the diverse audience to whom 1 Corinthians was addressed. Writing to a church in the largest Roman colony in the empire, Paul would have triggered unnecessary hostility in the wider community if he had written, "In our new fellowship, Romans, Greeks, and Jews are all equal." In Corinth, the Romans were inevitably at the top of the pecking order. The town was in Greece, so the Greeks would have been second. As powerless foreigners, the Jews would naturally have been at the bottom of that threesome. He goes on to say a rough equivalent might be an American military base in Germany. On the base, the Americans run everything. The Germans who work there would be second, and any Turkish guest workers would be third. Paul was a Roman citizen. Romans would naturally prefer Roman leadership. Greeks wanted to listen to a native Greek speaker, and Jews would naturally lean toward a Jewish leader, especially if he was from Galilee or Judea, and thereby from the home country. Their various ethnic loyalties were quite likely causing serious tension in the church, and Paul may well have been referring to those loyalties. A group in the church claimed, "We are of Christ," and that phrase implies, "The rest of you are not of Christ." We alone can claim that identification. Bailey continues, "Many churches have a small clique of people who consider themselves the true believers. They are not sure of the salvation of their pastor, but they are praying for him." Self-righteousness is usually on display in such groups, and dealing with them can be extremely difficult. Perhaps something of the same dynamic was present in Corinth and elsewhere. Paul continues, "Was Paul crucified for you? No. Jesus died for you. Were you baptized in the name of Paul? Of course not." Paul's point about who baptized whom trivializes any importance put on who conducted one's baptism by pointing out he has baptized nearly no one. Well, except for a few, or more, or, oh well, who remembers? Is pretty much the way he puts it in his letter. It is about Jesus Christ and him crucified, and Jesus cannot be divided according to teacher or tradition. If we belong together to Christ, we must belong to one another. I once mentioned to someone here that one comment I continue to hear frequently begins like this. When Pastor Michael was here, that person replied, "Well, that's interesting." Because what Pastor Michael said to me recently was that when he was here, he got weary of hearing when Pastor Denny was here. It's human, right? It's easy to forget that we collectively and individually, we are called to follow Jesus and not a human, even if that human is a leader in the church that we love. But if we pull back from 1 Corinthians and look at the readings as a whole that we heard today, there's two themes that run through all of them. They're about time, and they're about transformation. We read about contrasts between what happened in the past and what's happening now. Which things have happened and have reached a finite conclusion, which are rolling forward into the future as yet unseen. Taken together, the message is good news. You are more than you were and more than you realize. The lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, once considered forsaken, become vessels of life. Disciples are called from fishing nets into apostleship. Isaiah's exiled people find gloom transformed to light, depopulation to increase, ravaged lands to bountiful harvest, burdens to freedom. The psalmist finds fear filled up with strength, trouble met with shelter from the storm, and enemies transformed into a comforting, welcoming people. In all these things, past points of reference, usually negative, are overwhelmed by a new living reality full of spirited hope. New light does not erase the past, it illuminates it, admitting truth, but also delineating the boundaries of its power to contain or define us. There's a sense of release from limitations that runs through multiple points in the readings today. The disciples are in the business of trapping fish in familiar waters to feed themselves. They will soon be in the business of freeing humanity across multiple borders, feeding thousands. A psalmist once hemmed in by enemies is raised high above with the whole world in view. Members of a divided church in Corinth hear Paul recount how the ultimate limit of death on the cross was transformed in the freedom of life everlasting. This transformation bears fruit. In Isaiah, people build. In the Psalm, they sing. In 1 Corinthians, people come together boldly and foolishly proclaiming salvation. In Matthew, they walk throughout the region sharing good news and healing every hurt. The good news is that whatever we once were, we find fulfillment and new purpose as the kingdom sweeps us along. We are in a time of transition now at King of Kings. I have announced my plans to retire from congregational leadership in June, and the church council is meeting today with Pastor Dana Rudstadt, who has joined us, to hear about a process that will help guide us into a vision for the future. Dinners for 8 are underway beginning this week, so that you can begin participating in the process of discernment, listening together for where God is leading you next. It will be tempting to want to keep things the same, to simply return or continue to what makes you comfortable. The temptation will be strong, as I am fully aware that many of us, myself included, at this point in time, are woefully uncomfortable. To better prepare you for these conversations, I'd like to leave you with this thought. We tend to describe the disciples leaving their nets as a huge sacrifice. But assuming the status quo is great, let alone indispensable, is a mark of privilege. Let me say that again. Assuming the status quo is great, let alone indispensable, is a mark of privilege. What systems and conventions do we accept as real and binding, coloring our view of God and the way we carry God into the world? Jesus transformed the disciples' definition of fishing. He asked them to not just leave their nets, but their boats, their fish, and the very concept that they would fish for fish. Think about that. How unlikely was it that they actually complied completely? So here's the question for you to ponder. The situation to imagine as you begin the important work of discernment. Would the story of Jesus calling those first disciples work? Would it have the same effect on us today, inspiring us? If the disciples tried to transform Jesus instead, remaining on their boats, fitting him into their net. What might have happened if instead of them following Jesus, they tried to negotiate that Jesus follow them? That Jesus simply join them in their comfortable boats with their worn nets to fish for fish that they could broil over a fire instead of fishing for people far from the lake they loved. No one has ever claimed that following Jesus would be easy. But millions of people who have followed Jesus confess that doing so, looking back, was the absolute right thing to do. Millions have said, following Jesus saved my life. It changed their lives by orienting them toward love. Love that is patient. Love that is kind. Love that does not end.
You just heard from Reverend Marie Duquette, pastor at King of Kings in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can help support this ministry by texting your contribution to 833-950-1405. That's the U.S. 833-950-1405. You can find the full service video on YouTube Live at BE Lifted. Drop us a comment or join us on live chat at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Sunday mornings.